for our military. And the interesting fact here, in spite of the rhetoric that my opponent has just spoken, is that the reality is that if you look at our projected budgets for the next 10 years, Al Gore and I actually commit more than twice as much, $100 billion in additional funding for our military than Governor Bush does. And their budget allows nothing additional for acquisition of new weapon systems, and that's something that the same General Mike Ryan of the Air Force and all the other chiefs of the services will not be happy about, because they need the new equipment, the new systems that Al Gore and I are committed to giving them.
Bernie, this is a special interest of mine. I'd like a chance to elaborate further, if I might. The facts are dramatically different. I'm not attacking the military, Joe. I have enormous regard for the men and women of the U.S. military. I had the great privilege of working with them for the 4 years I was Secretary of Defense, and no one has a higher regard than I do for them. But it's irresponsible to suggest that we should not have this debate in a presidential campaign, that we should somehow ignore what is a major, major concern. And if you have friends or relatives serving in the U.S. military, you know there's a problem. If you look at the data that's available, 40% of our Army helicopters that are not combat ready. Combat readiness level in the Air Force that's dropped from 85% to 65%. Significant problems of retention. The important thing for us to remember is that we're a democracy, and we're defended by volunteers. Everybody out there tonight wearing the uniform, standing on guard to protect the United States, is there because they volunteered to put on the uniform. And when we don't give them the spare parts they need to maintain their equipment, when we don't give our pilots the flying hours they need to maintain their proficiency, when we don't give them the kind of leadership that spells out what their mission is and lets them know why they're there and what they're doing, why they're putting their lives at risk, then we undermine that morale. That is an extraordinarily valuable trust. There is no more important responsibility for a President of the United States than his role as Commander-in-Chief and the obligation that he undertakes on behalf of all of us to decide when to send our young men and women to war. When we send them without the right kind of training, when we send them poorly equipped or with equipment that's old and broken down, we put their lives at risk. We will suffer more casualties in the next conflict if we don't look to those basic fundamental problems now. And with all due respect, Joe, this administration has a bad track record in this regard, and it's available for anybody who wants to look at the record, who wants to talk to our men and women in uniform, who wants to spend time with the members of the Joint Chiefs, wants to look at readiness levels and other indicators. Final point, the issue of procurement is very important, because we're running now off the buildup of the investment we made back during the Reagan years. As that equipment gets old, it has to be replaced, and we've taken money out of the procurement budget to support other ventures. We have not been investing in the future of the U.S. military.
Bernie, I think it's very important to respond to this. Yes, of course, it's an important debate to have as part of this campaign, but I don't want either the military to feel uneasy or the American people to feel insecure. And what I'm saying now, I'm basing on service on the Senate Armed Services Committee, talking to exactly the people Dick Cheney has mentioned, the Secretary of Defense, the Chiefs of Staff. I've visited our fighting forces around the world, and I'm telling you that we are ready to meet any contingency that might arise. The good news here, and the interesting news, is that we have met our recruitment targets in each of the services this year. In fact, in the areas where our opponents have said we are overextended, such as the Balkans, the soldiers there have the higher rate of re-enlistment than anywhere else in the service, because they feel a sense of purpose, a sense of mission. In fact, this administration has begun to transform the American military, to take it away from being a Cold War force, to prepare it to meet the threats of the new generation of tomorrow, of weapons of mass destruction, of ballistic missiles, of terrorism, even of cyber warfare. And the fact is that Governor Bush recommended in his major policy statement on the military earlier this year that we skip the next generation of military equipment. Helicopters, submarines, tactical air fighters, all the rest. That would really cripple our readiness, exactly the readiness that Dick Cheney is talking about. Al Gore and I are committed to continuing this acquisition program, transforming the military. There's fewer people in uniform today, but person to person, person by person, unit by unit, this is the most powerful and effective military, not only in the world today, but in the history of the world. And again, Al Gore and I will do whatever is necessary to keep it that way.
Senator Lieberman, this question to you. Once again, in the Middle East, peace talks on the one hand, deadly confrontations on the other, and the flashpoint Jerusalem. And then there's Syria. Is United States policy what it should be?
Yes, it is. It has truly pained me in the last week, Bernie, to watch the unrest and the death occurring in the Middle East between the Israelis and the Palestinians. So much work has been done by the people there with the support of this administration. So much progress has been made in the original Oslo agreements between the Israelis and the Palestinians adopted in 1993, in the peace between Israel and Jordan thereafter. I mean, America has a national strategic interest and a principled interest in peace in the Middle East, and Al Gore has played a critical role in advancing that process over the last 8 years. What pains me as I watch the unrest in recent days between the Israelis and the Palestinians is that these two peoples have come, in some senses, generations forward, centuries forward in the last 7 years. They are so close to a final peace agreement. I hope and pray that the death and unrest in the last week will not create the kinds of scars that make it hard for them to go back to the peace table with American assistance and achieve what I'm convinced the great majority of the Israeli and Palestinian people want, indeed people throughout the Middle East, which is peace. Secretary Albright has been in Paris meeting with Prime Minister Barak and Chairman Arafat. I hope and pray that her mission is successful, that there is a ceasefire, and the parties return to the peace table. Now, we've been on a very constructive course in the Middle East, played an unusual, unique role, and I am convinced that Al Gore and I commit that Al Gore and I will continue to do that. I hope I might, through my friendships in Israel and throughout the Arab world, play a unique role in bringing peace to this sacred region of the world.
Bernie, it has been a very, very difficult area to work in for a long time. Numerous administrations going back certainly to World War II have had to wrestle with the problem of what should happen in the Middle East. We made significant breakthroughs, I think, at the end of the Bush administration because of the Gulf War. In effect, we had joined together with Arab allies and done enormous damage to the Iraqi armed forces, and Iraq at the time was the biggest military threat to Israel. By virtue of the end of the Cold War, the Soviets were no longer a factor. They used to fish in troubled waters whenever they had the opportunity in the Middle East, but with the end of the Soviet Union, the implosion, if you will, of the empire, that created a vacuum, if you will, and made it easier for us to operate there. We were able to, I think, reassure both Arabs and Israelis that the United States would play a major role there, that we had the ability and the will to deploy forces to the region if we had to engage in military operations to support our friends and oppose our foes. And of course, we were able to convene the Madrid conference that, in effect, was the first time Arab and Israeli sat down face to face and began this process of trying to move the peace